of the FBI and its political corruption. I am pleased to welcome Kyle Seraphin to the show. He is an indefinitely suspended FBI special agent and U.S. Air Force veteran, as well as a former restaurant manager, movie studio financial manager, paramedic, practicing Catholic, husband, and father. He is a jack of all trades, a true Renaissance man. He originally served in the FBI's Washington field office in counterintelligence and specialty surveillance, and then he was transferred to New Mexico to work on criminal cases. Mr. Seraphin was indefinitely suspended from the FBI in April of 2022, and since then, he has been very brave with publicly discussing the FBI's rampant political corruption, including the agency's alleged targeting of parents who are protesting school board meetings, sexual misconduct by senior FBI management, abuse of FISA authority, and election interference. Kyle, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
It is my pleasure, Julie.
So we were having a really fun discussion before we went on the air, and I would like to ask you to please tell the viewers, if you feel comfortable, about your older daughter, Olivia, because the story that you told me about her, I think, is so funny. I think they'd enjoy it, if you're willing.
Yeah, sure. My daughter is a mini version of myself, and she's massively accelerated. So I think I told my wife, my parents thought I was smarter than them when I was 12. I'm pretty sure my daughter's going to surpass me when she's 7 or 8. She's just kind of precocious and beyond her years. But we had a discussion the other day. My wife and I were talking about something on Twitter. I discussed how, somebody was upset about me teaching my daughters how to shoot, which I have because we own guns and I believe in gun safety for all ages and age appropriately, of course. But it's important for my girls to learn how to be safe around them. And while I'm having this discussion about some random person on Twitter being mad about it, my daughter pipes up and she said, Dad, I don't understand. Like, what do they think should happen? I mean, how else are women going to defend themselves if a man were going to attack them? And when should they learn if they're not young? So she kind of goes into this diatribe about being a young, shooter. And she is. She shot handguns. She shot bolt action rifles. She shot semi-automatic rifles with me. We're only doing 22s. I spent a lot of money to get suppressors so I can teach them in a way that's not threatening, because I just think it's important to learn a lot about tools, whether it be a chainsaw or a car or anything else. So
She seems like a total hoot. And what's funny is that's not even the story that I was referring to. But by the way, I'm so glad that you told it. I was referring to the other one where she's a spokesperson for you.
She is. Yeah,
telling people why you lost your job.
Yeah, she briefs people wherever we go. So I don't have to worry about it too much. We show up at a playground and people go, "Oh, are you from around here?" And then she's got the whole story, and my dad didn't get a shot and the FBI fired him, but he didn't really get fired. And so we had to sell our house. I had to leave all my friends, like the whole thing. It's and you just look at these adults' eyes and they just get bigger and bigger and they're going like, who is this little person? And also, is any of this stuff true? And we're over here nodding like, yeah, that's true.
I just love this image of the 5-year-old going up to people and saying, my dad was in the FBI and now he's been indefinitely suspended. I can imagine the reaction. People are like slowly walking backward. So now on to my first question that I originally intended for you, but telling Olivia's stories is obviously very important too. And I welcome many more of your kids if you have them throughout the interview. But first, let's start off with, why did you want to join the FBI? And I'm always curious. I interviewed Thomas Baker. I didn't even ask you before the program if you know him, but he, like you, is a brave FBI whistleblower. And he was telling me a little bit about the process of being recruited to the FBI. What was your experience and why did you want to join?
I'm familiar with Thomas. I haven't spoken with him. I think a lot of us have the same instincts, patriotism, service, things like that. I have a pretty robust sense of right and wrong, which has kind of led me to where I'm at right now. But let's see. I actually probably first started thinking about this when I was 26. That would have been in 2007 or 8, something to that effect. And I realized that I wasn't doing anything that I felt was valuable. I'd managed a restaurant, as you said. I'd been in corporate sales. I'd sold $20 million worth of Dell computers, and I worked for a radio station, some other things. I got this job working for Warner Brothers, and I was doing finance, and I was, going in on the headquarters on Riverside every day. And I just felt like, what am I doing? Like, what is the purpose of my existence? So I did this long, examination of content, examination of skills, examination of sort of values. And what I kind of came up with, this is kind of funny. I came up with this idea that if I had been around 10,000 years ago, then my place would have been in front of my tribe, either hunting animals and laying in the grass for 3 days to stalk a buffalo, or trying to block invading tribes that were trying to do harm to us. So I just kind of felt like I had this sort of protective type role. People who know me know that I'm very aggressive about injustice and things like that. So that's what I decided to do. So I joined the Air Force, knowing that that was the only way that I was going to make it into the FBI. And it wasn't like a life dream. It was just kind of like this is a possibility. And it slowly became a reality. So 2009, joined the Air Force, did that for just shy of 4 years. Got out, I was a paramedic, and I was an air traffic controller and a bunch of other goofy skills that I don't ever use. I went to combat dive school and jumped out of planes and stuff like that. And so I end up in this kind of funny spot where I'm making $15 an hour, and I'm riding on an ambulance, and then I worked in a hospital, and I did that for a little while. And the whole time I was kind of thinking, like, what's the next step? Am I going to go to med school? Am I going to, what am I going to do when I grow up? I'm 31, 32 years old at that point. And I threw in a package. Exactly. Well, I had a guy who just retired from the FBI the other day, and he told me he's not sure what he wants to be when he grows up after 22 years in the Bureau. So this is a common thing. We're kind of outdoors, like rough and tumble type boys, I think, in some ways, like very, very, lost boys types, but not lost, just motivated to do things. And we never were really done. So long and short, I throw in this application for the Bureau, and then I just forgot about it because they didn't call me back right away. And my wife and I made some other plans. And by the time they came back to me, we had already rented out our apartment and put everything in storage. And we thought we were going to go buy a bed and breakfast in Vermont, which is weird. I'd never even been to Vermont, but she was into it. So we went up to Vermont. She didn't like that. And the FBI called me back and said, hey, could you come in and meet us at the New Haven field office? And so I did. And that took about 18 months worth of interviews and meet and greets and backgrounds and all this other kind of stuff. And eventually offered the position and showed up at Quantico in 2016, in the summer of 2016, with 3 days notice of all things. They called me and said, we got a spot. It's not your spot. Someone else dropped out. And if you can be here, you can start on Sunday. So I did.
What is it like to walk into a field office of the FBI for an interview? I have this sort of movie-like picture where there are all of these agents like crossing their arms in all black, and they're looking at you with this menacing look in their eyes. Is that what it is, or is it far less intimidating?
It's a government building. They're not impressive a lot of times. Now, driving up was interesting. I had a gate guard come in, and they have a rollback fence and the razor wire and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of interesting. Got in there. People were pretty nice. It was, check in, leave your phone. Sat down with a lady who was in a suit. I was in a suit. We all looked like we belonged in the right places. But you got to also remember, I spent time in the Air Force. I went through SEER school. So I've been through, a prison camp. I've been starved for a week in the woods and then had the crap beat out of me. So it's a little bit less intimidating when you've gone through some stuff like that. I spent a night in jail when I was in the Air Force. Actually, I got tossed in and locked up. So I saw a little bit more life than a lot of people. I think if you were 23 or 24, it'd probably be pretty intimidating. But I was almost 35 by the time I showed up. So it was kind of, it's just a bunch of adults doing work in an office that just happens to have, heavy glass and a security guard.
I know it sounds like a corny question, and we're going to go back to specifically talking about the FBI, but you throw out these things that you've done or things that you've experienced, and I can't just let them pass by without asking you, what is it like to be starved and thrown out, whatever you said, into the woods for a week? I mean, what does that experience possibly feel like? And again, corny question, but what did you learn from it?
So like a lot of the things that I did that were tough, they're tougher when you're doing them than after. You look back and you go like, yeah, I did that again. That wasn't so bad. Being hungry is fine. Actually, it's not the worst thing in the world to go hungry for a week. And, I think I ate like a carrot and a couple of bites of rabbit stew, which I actually didn't like that much. So I kind of just figured, we'll probably eat in a couple of days. I just don't want to eat that. That's not very good. No flavor. There was no salt. There's no pepper. There was no anything out there. We killed a rabbit, skinned it, threw it in a bucket, and then we basically boiled it up and ate it, which is not very great. But essentially, as long as you're not talking to other people when you haven't eaten in a couple of days, I think that's kind of it. I mean, a lot of people do fasts. I mean, it's nothing exceptional. The fact is that we were hiking around in the mountains out in Washington State, so that was a little bit of a challenge because when you're hiking and you're navigating, you kind of have to communicate with the people you're with. So those conversations would be strained, I would say. People get pretty aggressive when they're hungry. And once you've done it for a couple of days, it's just, it's kind of snappy. It's not the most enjoyable, hiking partner when they haven't eaten in a while. But it's not terrible. There's way worse things than that. I mean, I got drowned almost every day for 100 days, or darn near it, I guess is what they do.
Was this a Quantico, or was this part of your Air Force training?
Quantico was a gentleman's course. This is when I was in the Air Force. So they do a thing. They do a thing that's called water confidence in the training program I was in, where they find different ways to make you learn to be very comfortable with being uncomfortable underwater, and that includes, swimming in the dark and two grown men trying to kill you for 2 minutes at a time, and having to swim 50 meters underwater with all your kit on and all your gear and things like that. So when they do that kind of stuff, or doing flutter kicks with your feet over the edge of the railing or the edge of the pool, and then somebody's got a hose in your mouth and you're wearing a mask that's full of water, those are all kind of pretty awful. But they're also really funny because they're paying you a small amount of money to just get tortured. And people actually pay money to go do that stuff in these special operations challenges and stuff. So,
or reality TV shows.
Exactly that. Yep.
Does anything scare you?
Yes, for sure.
What?
My only phobia is dark water that I can't see the bottom of, and so I faced that a couple times. I did some dive training where they dumped us out in the water in the middle of the ocean, and then we had to swim underwater for an hour and a half to go hit a dock on the other end. That's pretty scary, but you can't really think about it when you're doing it because otherwise you'll just panic and you won't be able to accomplish anything. And there's a lot of things that scare me now that I'm a dad because I've got little kids that I'm responsible for. So I get more anxious, I guess, or more worried about how things are going to go down. What's going to happen with us, and am I going to be able to continue to provide for them? But I don't know. I try not to get distracted by it. It's the same thing as when you're doing anything else. You just got to put your mind on the task. So if you get distracted by fear or the anxiety, you'll be paralyzed. And I think a lot of people find that. I tend to be action oriented when things go wrong versus freezing. A lot of people freeze. It's the third thing. There's fight and there's flight. Those are both sympathetic responses, but freeze is the big one that most people do, I think, in this culture. You'll see it when you watch a video on social media and somebody is videotaping something horrible happening to someone. Like, why aren't you doing something? Because they're filming it. It's not because they want to film it. It's because they're frozen. They don't know how to do the action. So I tend to do the other.
Totally. I was watching a video on social media of those crazy, rancid, left-wing climate change fanatics throwing pasta and mashed potatoes at these beautiful paintings and galleries in Europe, and everyone around was silent. They were frozen, to your point. And that was arguably, at least in my eyes, that was more scary to me than the people who were throwing the pasta at the painting. Because the people who are throwing the pasta at the painting are just deranged. But then everyone else around them is just standing there with this resignation. And that, again, arguably is more of a sign of how terrible our culture has become, that people would not react. Sorry, go on.
No, you're right. And you know what? We can expand that a little bit too, I think. I think it's worth expanding. So think about this. In 2020, we had the governmental equivalent of people throwing pasta at a beautiful painting, right? I mean, we had lockdowns that happened in all these different states. We had all these illogical sort of orders that went down. All these people were saying all these things you had to go do. And most of America just stood by and let it happen. Mm-hmm. They just watched and they didn't do anything about it because it's a common reaction. Somebody will do something. We have a lot of comforts in Western society, in America, but also in Europe. There's a lot of creature comforts. There's a lot of allowing other people to take responsibilities that maybe we should be taking on ourselves. And so there's a guy named Mike Glover. He runs a Fieldcraft Survival. He's one of these people that I've kind of come in contact with since this all went down. And he always talks about be your own first responder. And I believe in that. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I joined the military, honestly. Like I looked around and I was like, I don't know how to do an overland infiltration into enemy territory. And I don't know how to, do a dive infiltration. And I don't know how to jump out of a plane and land with a bunch of gear and navigate through the woods to a target. And so I want to learn how to do those things. And I don't know how to stop a bleed or how to, save somebody's life if they're dying. And so I went and I picked up a bunch of skills. It was intentional. It's like, where am I as a man if I can't do all these things? And I didn't get married until after all that. So I came to my marriage with a bunch of these skills. I knew how to shoot. I knew how to build guns. I knew how to, work with explosives. I knew how to do a dive mission. I was a paramedic. I was an air traffic controller, like all these weird things that I went and picked up, mostly because I wanted to have all these capabilities. And I don't think you can really dedicate yourself to them when you're dedicating yourself to somebody else in the same way. So that was like my prereqs to being a useful partner. And my wife always laughs because it's like, what do we do in this case? It's like, why don't we do this? I do all kinds of stuff.
Well, it's amazing the skills that you've acquired, and I mean, you probably don't feel this way, but looking at you, feel like you are just set up for success for the rest of your life, because whatever hits you in life, you'll know how to deal with it, because nothing could possibly be as bad as some of the things that you have endured. And to your point, you've had to become your own, what was the term, paramedic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first responder, whatever the problem is. So it's funny. Okay, we talked about movies a little bit before we jumped on here and started taping. And I don't know if you saw the movie called Fight Club, but there was a book, so you could read the book. And the Fight Club is one of those things. There's a line in there that Ed Norton says, and he says, once you've been involved in Fight Club, it turns the volume down on all the other things that go wrong in your life. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but essentially, once you've done some really difficult things, you turn the volume down on the other difficulties, so it's easier to face them. And people in America oftentimes are looking around and trying to avoid difficulties. I know my father-in-law said this. He grew up in Manhattan, and he was like, "Oh, I don't know why you'd ever want to subject yourself to that." And it's like, well, like historically, men have always gone on challenges. They've always faced down difficulties, and the difficulties I did in my life are far less than people did 100 years ago every single day, because that was just the way their life was set up. So whenever I was I did some surveillance in Portland, and I watched all these Antifa people like tearing up the city, which was bizarre. And all I could think about was the ancestors who founded this town, this city of Portland. They came across the Oregon Trail. They risked everything. Susie died of cholera on the way. If you never played the video game when you're in the 80s, there was a whole video game about the Oregon Trail. And your producers will all know.
My producers are saying you're hilarious in my ear.
Well, it's all true. It's like this is what they had to do. They had to go and live like this horrifically difficult life. One of the things that we've done in our homeschool lessons that my wife does, and I didn't come up with this, so I'm really proud of her for doing it. She reads the Little House on the Prairie series to my daughters to explain to them about reality, which was not that far away. Like, in 2-3 generations back, people were facing the possibility of being killed by savages, as they called them, but they were just, Native Americans, Indians. They were the possibility of dying from disease, the possibility of their home falling apart, and they built their homes with their hands. And we're so detached from that. So I tried to just get a little bit of that. You know what I mean? I just wanted a little bit of that ruggedness, because it's really easy to go into an office and sit every day and have a chair that somebody else made and a desk that somebody else put together and some other factory made it, and there's a computer, and all you're doing is like looking for bad guys on a thing. Back in the day, FBI agents used to go out there and sit in a car or hang out in the bushes and look for bad guys. So that's why I volunteered to be on a surveillance team. I wanted to do the old school thing where you just go and like watch bad guys and get as close as possible and see what they're up to, which is a lot more interesting than typing all day.
I love this theme that you're talking about. It's so true that we try to insulate ourselves from difficulties. And one of the things that I say a lot in my political commentary, if you will, is that paradoxically, one of the worst things that happened to the United States is that it became so prosperous and so good, because now we have a class of people who think that, calling the first years at a college freshman is the worst offense in the world. We have people who can't even deal with a paper cut, And so I really admire you for wanting to face difficulties when you are not, and I'm not either. Many of us Americans are not in a position where we have to. And so relatedly, when you were talking about your time in the Air Force, it made me think of this question. And by the way, just for the audience sake, we will get to the FBI whistleblower stuff, maybe in like 3 hours. No, you're so interesting, and my God, what a life you've had. So I would be a bad interviewer if I didn't harp on these things. I went to Israel about a year ago through a trip with my college that took actually 100 Gentiles to Israel, which was really fun. And one of the things that made the greatest impression on me was the IDF. Obviously, but I'm telling the one person in the audience who may not know, everyone in Israel has to serve in the army, which is not obviously the case here in the United States. And I was so moved by their patriotism and by their commitment to their country, and they have to have this patriotism. It's more baked in because of their compulsory service, but also because they face so many threats to their existence every day. Israelis know better than anyone the preciousness of life. It's why at the end of every meal they cheers and they say l'chaim, to life, because they know that they could, face a terrorist attack, whether it's from Hezbollah or militants in the West Bank or Hamas. They are well aware of the fragility of their existence. And it made me think about the American military. And I've always wondered since then, but I've never had the opportunity to ask someone who has served, is there a sense of patriotism and deep commitment to the United States in our military? I think of the World War II generation, and I know that they had that, but is there that same sort of IDF-like or America during World War II-like sense of unity now in the military, or at least when you served?
So I got out in 2012, so my information is going to be a little bit dated, I guess. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think so. There's really two schools of thought in the military. There's a group of people that they want a job. I had a lady when I was getting out. She was like, "I have a desk job, and I don't have to work weekends. Like, what are you doing? Why would you leave?" And that was really funny to me because it's like I wanted to go to war, and I didn't go to war, so I'm leaving. That's what I'm doing. I signed up to go to war. It didn't happen because I was in training for 3.5 years of it. And I wasn't going to get to the end of it. And so I walked out based on that. And I was also 32. She goes, "When you're 25, you'll understand." And I was like, "Lady, you know what? Good luck to you." Mm-hmm. She was this Air Force staff sergeant. But yeah, then there's the other half. The other half, there's actually a great meme about this for the meme culture types. So one of them is like two nerdy looking guys, and they have like the misshapen heads that they do. They draw them kind of funny, like there's something wrong with them. And they say, "Let's join the military and learn some marketable skills." And then the other guy says, "Yes, and when we get out, we can transfer them into industry and make a good living." And like that, there is a whole group of people that do that. A lot of people in my basic training flight were talking about how they were going to get their college paid for. I enlisted. I had a college degree. I was 27. I was on the edge of I was the oldest guy in my basic training flight. And when I run across my tribe in the Air Force, and in the military in general, whether it be Marine or Army or Navy or Coast Guard, those are the kind of people like rescue swimmers and, people in the SEAL teams or SWIC and guys who are Green Berets or Rangers. Like those are my kind of people. I like hanging out with them because I like what they're about. And there's the second part of the meme says, and it's two guys, they got like the Nordic beard. They're the blonde guy who, has that kind of like whatever, probably the same haircut that I have. And they go, "Let's join the military and do really hard stuff." And the guy's like, "Yes." Like there's a whole bunch of people that want to join the military to do really hard stuff. Right. Simply because it's the right thing to do to make you a better man, to stand out there and learn. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to make sure that there is a pointy end of the stick that keeps the bad guys away for this country. And the FBI is not any different. There are two cultures within it as well. There are people in the Bureau that feel the same way. My last partner was a Green Beret. He's a stud. He just wanted to catch bad guys. That's all he wanted to do. Like, it's kind of the kind of people I want to hang out with.
Right.
The problem is there's a lot of political actors that wanted to just get a better paycheck and go hang out in DC. And they're kind of awful, and they're the ones that are really sullying it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of them, and they have a lot of power and influence. So a lot of times the people that want to do hard stuff and go catch bad guys, they're not necessarily given that opportunity, and they're being pulled away from it.
Right. Very nice transition into the
I do this all the time, right?
Yes,
you could tell. Clearly.
I'm like, thank you. You handed it to me on a platter. Let's move into this part of the discussion. So well, first, can you describe for us what you did in the FBI? In the intro, I read that you served in counterintelligence, in specialty surveillance, in criminal cases, and I probably acted like I knew exactly what that was, but I will admit to you that I don't. So can you describe to me your responsibilities within the FBI, and when did you smell a rat? When did you realize that there was something, as you have said publicly, corrupt about the organization?
Yeah, so I got assigned to Washington field office in November. I didn't actually show up until December of 2016. So this is at the end of the Jim Comey era. This is, President Trump had already been elected at that point. And I go to Washington field office, and I'm assigned completely illogically to a Chinese counterintelligence squad that doesn't deal with criminal counterintelligence. They deal with intelligence, which is the opposite of what I'm built to do in so many ways. And so I spent most of my time 8 to 10 hours a day in a SCIF, which is a compartmented facility that keeps, cell phones out and no outside electronics. And all you can do is, check out your computer screen. And my boss would want to know if I was, not at my desk and why I wasn't there. And I looked at FISA material, and I looked at, case files that would come in from national security letters, which are like the secret version of a subpoena. It's a tool that we're able to use to ask for bank records and for phone records and things like that. So I'd look over those kind of things, and I'd be building these cases on people that were not accused of doing a crime, which is, I think, a very difficult thing for most people to understand. And it was really difficult for me to sort of process. So, my job is that this person talked to somebody on Facebook, and now we have an investigation to find out what they're all about. That seems bizarre. It seems antithetical to the American way of life. And yet that was my job. So I asked a lot of questions about it. I knew that I didn't want to be there. I knew that wasn't something I wanted to do long term. And after doing that for about 18 months, which was about as long as I could handle, my boss and I had this like very candid conversation where she's asking me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I go, if I'm still in this office, like I won't be here at the end of the year. I'm not going to be doing this for 3 years. 2 years is probably the max. And so between just a stroke of fate and the fact that she gave me some kind of ammunition to bring to our oversight group, which is called Office of Professional Responsibility, I actually sort of forced a transfer to the specialty surveillance squad, which all they did was sit in their cars and watch terrorists. They watched white collar criminals. They watched gang members. They watched child sex traffickers, photographs, video, following them around. And we would do what's called FISURE, or physical surveillance. So you're physically out there in the world, taking pictures of them coming out of a doorway. So what does that do? That gives us residents that we know we might be able to do a search warrant on later. We would grab their license plates. And so when you have that, then you can run back and find out who owns the car. So you might find some financial connections. You find out where they've gotten tickets. So maybe where they go, where is it registered to, all these kind of things. So, physical surveillance is an old school tool. It's my favorite kind of work to do in a lot of ways. It's a learned skill. It's a lot like hunting. You have to be incredibly patient. You might be sitting there for 7 hours doing nothing, just sitting in your car, peeing in a bottle, just literally like looking through a pair of binos when no one's looking and watching a door to make sure. And then when someone moves, man, that's when the chase happens. And that's incredibly interesting and fun. And then you've got to coordinate a whole team between your radios and your visual. And sometimes we'd have a plane or a helicopter that would work on us, depending on the level of sensitivity and the type of case. And it's really fun because you're moving a bunch of pieces around in real life. It's a lot like when I did air traffic control training, where you're talking to all these different assets, you're moving them into place, you're trying to outthink your adversary, you're making sure they don't see you, you're assessing, what we call our heat status, which is like how likely it is that they're going to know that we're there. So we pull them off, and it's a chess game. It's really fun. So I did that, and you can only do that for so long though, because the hours are weird. The sitting in a car is actually not really great for your body. And we didn't get out all the time. And when you did, we'd go around and try to see what people were up to in a mall, or where they went to a store, and who they're talking to, or what kind of packages they're shipping at a FedEx or something like that. So we do all that kind of stuff. And then I put in for a transfer because I was living outside of Washington, D.C., which is also not what I wanted to be doing in my life.
I bet.
And we got an opportunity to move out to Las Cruces, New Mexico. So I put in for that. It was supposedly a competitive transfer. They had 2 spots, exactly 2 guys asked to be moved out to Las Cruces. So it was me and then my future partner at that time, like you said, who's a Green Beret and reservist. So that was pretty neat. And I got out there, and they said, you got 2 options. You can work public corruption, or you can work Indian crimes, which is that the FBI has the responsibility for all major crimes on all federally delineated Indian reservations. And so I had done a little bit of that work on a temporary duty, and I was into it. And so I volunteered for that. And my job was 100 miles away from my office, which I drove, sometimes a couple times a day. I would drive out, and then I would do something, and I would come back to the office, and then I'd go home, and then they would call me and tell me somebody hung themselves. And then I would drive another 100 miles out there in the dark, and then I would go and deal with the body. And then I would drive back home 100 miles, go to sleep, and do it again the next day. So that was kind of a wild little thing. Not a lot of people want to do that, but for me, it was interesting, and it was one of those skill sets that not everybody can do it. But I've been around dead bodies. I've been around people who have abuse. I have a pretty good understanding of physiology and anatomy from my paramedic time. So it was a good fit for what I was interested in. And then it's kind of old school too. You're like a detective. You're out there dealing with major crimes, sex assaults, and death investigations, and whatever else. Arson.
A few follow-up questions. So when you were talking about that first responsibility that you had in counterintelligence with the FBI spying on citizens who, make a Facebook post or send a message, and you sort of hinted at this, but how much of it did you think was justified? Because from an outsider's point of view, one can understand why the FBI may need to spy on certain citizens, especially if they are communicating in a menacing way if they may pose a domestic threat. But then we, as we saw with the Twitter files and a lot of the information that has come out in recent months about the FBI, about obtaining the FISA warrant with the phony Steele dossier to spy on Carter Page and Rudy Giuliani, we see that it's gone too far. So what, if you could just give me like a rough percentage, how much of it did you think was justified and how much wasn't?
A lot of it was not. Let me give you this number. So there's probably maybe 100 to 150 agents that are working counterintelligence at Washington field office. When they did an assessment, as they started locking down the federal government for COVID, which they locked down the Washington field office, the counterterrorism and the counterintelligence divisions got locked down, and they started showing up 30 minutes twice a week. That was the requirement. You come in for a part of one day, 2 times a week, for all these agents that were doing CI. And when they did that, they had everybody submit all their casework. And you got to figure every agent probably has between 8 and 12 cases. So let's average out to 10. Let's say there was 1,000 cases. That's probably a pretty good number of how many cases that division was working. Of those 1,000 cases, you want to guess the number that needed daily updates that were important enough for the supervisors to hear about it every single day?
500? I don't know. 2?
2.
Oh my gosh.
Not 200, 2.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea. And those were probably espionage cases. And those were probably active espionage type things where people are actively moving around. And it doesn't mean that people don't betray this country. They certainly do. And there are people out there that are working against them. But when there are 2 cases in 1,000 that require a daily update, it tells you sort of the priority set. And that doesn't mean that some of them weren't like every other, once a week updates. But these are not imminent dangers to the American people. These are long-term investigations. And some of them are just literally there only to exist. Like they exist so that the person has a job. There's a funny joke about how most of the federal jobs are actually just the federal jobs program. They exist because people need a job and federal government pays them to do that job. Whether or not that job has any value to the American people is a totally different animal. And you could see that when they would do these government shutdowns in 2019. I want to say in the winter of 2019, we had a sequester where they didn't pass a new budget, and we all got told that we were going to work without a paycheck until they passed a new budget. And if you were a quote unquote non-essential personnel, you didn't come in for federal work. That included all departments, not just DOJ, but everywhere. And man, traffic was amazing. It was really easy to commute to the office during that time. It was a really fun time to be a federal employee, and nobody in America noticed any difference. And I think that's really important to know. There's a lot of people who have jobs just because they need jobs, not because they do anything of value.
Well, certainly the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers that are, in all of these federal offices, and now thanks to our lovely President Biden, there'll be these equity committees or departments within every federal agency. So that proves your point. And even the way that I really realized what you were saying is by doing more research on the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. And how many journalists and defense contractors benefit from us going to war. I mean, it really is just amazing, to your point, to think about how many jobs exist just so the person can have a job. Before we move on from this counterintelligence point, I don't know if you're at will to give any specifics, and obviously I'm not trying to pressure you or put you in a tough position, but can you give me some idea of what these cases were about that the federal government was pursuing? Like what were these people doing who they were spying on?
Sure. So I've talked about this publicly. I'll be vague enough that I think it's acceptable. But essentially, there was a case that I inherited right away. It had been open for somewhere between 5 and 8 years. They were all kind of older cases. Some of these were approved by Peter Strzok, which is kind of funny. He was a supervisor at Washington Field, and they were around long enough to have had his name on them as the original approver. So this is an employee, federal employee, worked for one of the departments, GS-15 level. So that's the top of the general schedule of federal employment. It's a decent paycheck. And this guy that I got this case on, the allegation is that he had gone to grad school with a known Chinese spy. And that was it. That was the entirety of the case. And so then,
did they know each other? Did they talk?
Yeah. They had known each other in grad school at some point in time, but this was not recently. Yeah, I mean, this was well before this case was opened. Right. And this guy was a grown man who had already had 6 or 7 or 8 years in the federal service and then left and went somewhere else and, worked in another field. So we're talking about someone that is not just getting out of grad school. This is, maybe a decade and a half later. And when he had filled out his background check form, what's called the SF-86, he had been really lazy about it. And I'm like, look, I read people for a living, right? I read his file and it was like, where did you live at that time? And it's like, Cincinnati. It's like, who would have known me? You. And it's like, Marcia Clark or whatever. It's like, who was Marcia Clark? She was a girlfriend. Where does she live? Cincinnati. It was like, usually you put like addresses and phone numbers and contact and emails and all this stuff. These are really exhaustive documents. You try to like fill it out. This guy knew he had the job, so he didn't care. And so he was really lazy about filling it out. And I could tell how lazy it was because I read it and I understand how people work. So this investigation goes on for, like I said, somewhere between 5 and 8 years, something to that effect. Phone records, bank records, all this other stuff. There's nothing that would fall into what we would call derogatory, which is to say like a positive contact that would be that'd be suspicious. And so I finally got approval after a year of asking. This is my first year of asking, can I go interview this guy and just ask him some questions? Like I'll do it under a ruse, which is to say, I say I'm there for one reason, but I'm really there for somewhere else. And I sat down and talked to him and I go, listen, look, I got your SF-86. You didn't report any foreign contacts. And that's alerting because I know you were stationed overseas for 5 of the 6 years you worked for the government. So can we, backfill that in? Would you mind giving me some foreign contacts? And I defined what that meant. And he was like, sure. And he goes, let me just tell you right up front though, I was really lazy when I filled that out. And I go, I know, man. So then we did this very nice interview and he was really, really kind. And we talked about some things. And at the end of it, the guy gives me, I brought up, I said, look, I'm going to name some threat countries and some names and tell me if you know any of these people. And, he positively ID'd the person that I was interested in. And then at the end of it all, in a very easy way, he goes, yeah, I haven't talked to that guy in forever. I said, if he called you up and asked you to go to dinner, would you go with him? And he goes, didn't he get kicked out of the country for being a spy? And I go, yeah, he did. And he goes, yeah, I don't want to talk to that guy. Why would I talk to him? And I was like, okay, straightforward. He goes, let me pull my last Facebook, conversation. And he printed it out and gave it to me. And that was it. And that was the entire case. And then I closed it. But like that went on for, the better part of a decade. So that's the kind of cases we're talking about. They exist only for me to put something in the file every 90 days to justify that I'm a, counterintelligence agent. And that's, like I said, it's not to say that there aren't some righteous cases. I'm sure there are. I saw a lot of them that are not. And that number, 2 out of 1,000, tells you how many of them are really critical needs. And if that guy had turned out to have known him, so what? Like the spy got kicked out of the country. Right. So then where are we? You know what I mean? So like the damage was already mitigated, and yet we were still invading this guy's privacy and looking into his life forever. That's it's troubling to me because I don't want people looking into people's lives, your life, my life, or anybody else's.
So we know what these FBI agents were doing. I'd like you to answer, what should they be doing?
Well, they're doing what they're asked. That's what's really hard. What should be done is that we should assess accurately what the counterintelligence threat looks like, and then assign the number of bodies, the number, human beings, they always say bodies, assign the number of people to that threat based on the actual accurate assessment of what the need is. But that's not how it works. When you are a division special agent in charge, when you are running if you're an assistant special agent in charge and running one of these groups, your goal is to have the most number of people underneath you, because then you can write about how many people you supervise so that when you get the next job, you can say why you're such a good fit to manage these people because you've already managed so many people. So none of them ever want to lose any, what we call FSL or field staffing levels. That's just the number of people working for them. They don't want to lose any employees in their little fiefdom. It has nothing to do with whether the mission makes sense. And then the problem is there's this back scratching process that goes on between headquarters and the field offices that basically headquarters, assesses that this is going to be the big problem. And the field office says yes or no and how many. And so they're always trying to do sort of pre-crime, assign a bunch of people to it. And then so they're incentivized to go and build cases, whether or not their cases exist. So when the FBI says there's going to be a bunch of white supremacy next year, then they got to go find it because they promised that to Congress. That's how their budget is determined. And they got to open X number of cases. They got to have X number of man hours to it and all these other things.
Important.
It's all backwards. It's not like what is the threat and how do we deal with it? The FBI is like the least nimble organization I've ever been a part of. And at this point, I think it's one of the most evil things I've ever been a part of. And it's only because I just keep seeing things every single day, whether it be sexual malfeasance by the senior executives or whether it's, canceling whistleblowers, which they've done a bunch of. And some of the things they've done are horrific to people that literally didn't even do the thing that they think they did, because I know who did the thing they did that they accused them of, and they didn't get it right. So, when the FBI doesn't even look out for the civil liberties or the actual statutory requirements that they have for whistleblowers or other employees, how in the world are they going to take care of people in the United States? Like, you can't tell me that they're going to look out for American citizens. No way. They're not even looking out for their employees. It's really bad. And at this point, more and more retired agents are coming to us and going like, yeah, we get it. We know what you're saying.
When do you think this changed? I mean, look, people talk about J. Edgar Hoover and the corruption of the FBI, that it's always been this corrupt organization. Do you think that's true? Or do you think that there was a time in history when it was mostly righteous? Of course, nothing is perfect. And if so, when do you think it really changed into it sounds like thoroughly corrupt organization it is today?
So the FBI's had highs and lows. Like, there's been, significant sins of the Bureau in every decade. And you can go back and see that. We do penance for some of them. Like, the FBI sends all the new trainees that are in the academy to go to the Martin Luther King Memorial. It's like a bunch of 8th graders walking around in DC on a field trip.
That's the
and then
penance?
like a bunch of
future FBI just going agents. To a memorial?
Yeah, we just walk around there, look at his like statues and stuff. And you have to go and talk about what your favorite quote was that was engraved in stone. And that's pretty weird. So, there are things in the 70s that, look, they went after communists. You're not supposed to go after communists. It's a political ideology. So that's really difficult for you to do that. But we did that. I say we, just the Bureau did. The COINTELPRO stuff in the 70s, 60s, and 70s was all bad. A lot of this, they told MLK to kill himself and, wrote letters trying to expose him. So they were doing things that were evil. But I think most of the mission, most of the primary work that most agents experienced, and they were the most important part of the FBI at that point, was going after criminals, whether it was the mafia, doing the La Cosa Nostra, whether they were going after bank robbers, whether they're going after kidnappers. People had a pretty pure mission and they tried to live that out. The real recent change that I've been able to sort of pinpoint and what, the corruption that you and I are talking about, I think it happened, at least the seed of it started growing on September 12th of 2001. And the reason why, and I had a very I think, sophisticated insight that a friend of mine gave me. He said that after September 11th in 2001, the United States accepted a totally different and radically different definition of national security. And it went from the United States constitutional republic will continue, and the Constitution will be the supreme law of our land. That was the thing that we all swore to before. And the definition changed to no American dies at the hands of a terrorist on American soil. That was September 12th of 2001. And once you accept a no-risk policy, and like, we talked about being hard and doing things that are difficult. When you try to do no risk, you might as well just weld yourself into your house. The Chinese were doing zero COVID policy by locking people in their house, and they were throwing themselves from their apartments. That's the same kind of thing that we're talking about here. We're talking about how do you take all risk off the table, and the only way you do that is totalitarianism, authoritarianism, no freedom, surveillance state. That's how you do that. And it led us from being concerned about foreign terrorists to being concerned about people who are domestic but were sympathizing with foreign terrorists. It's called homegrown violent extremists, HVEs. And then once you're looking inside the United States, then you start looking at domestic terrorism, which Chris Wray did an interview with Brett Baird, just the other day. And his statement was that all types of terrorism are the biggest risk right now. They're all at their highest levels. It's like, no, they're not. Don't be ridiculous. That's absurd. It's an absurd thing that everything is equally dangerous. It's not. It's just, that's not how threats work. But that's how it is if you want to keep your budget. And that's what, they're incentivized to do that right now.
It's very interesting that you say that you really think it changed on September 12th, 2001 and onward. When I interviewed Tom Baker, he said the same thing. And he told me that when he joined the FBI in the 70s, I believe it was, or I actually think earlier it was in the 60s, because he worked on the MLK assassination case. Mm-hmm. He said that he was given by his superiors at the FBI a pocketbook copy of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And he says that he was told by this superior that the Bill of Rights is not a constraint on their work. It allows them to do their work in the best way. In other words, they shouldn't view it as something that's holding them back, but as an obligation that they have to fulfill. And then he said, things really changed after 9/11 because everyone was so terrified of another event like that happening that they kind of tossed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights out of the window. in the name of safety and counterterrorism, which of course we all are rooting for. But to your point, it seems that it has really been abused, that any action can be justified in the name of quote unquote safety.
Definitely. So here's the thing about counterterrorism. Freedom is dangerous inherently, and I prefer dangerous freedom and personal responsibility to a government taking care of me because I don't trust governments. I've worked for the government for about 10 years, and it's long enough for me to know that it doesn't make great decisions, it doesn't spend our money well, and it doesn't do anything the way that you would do it for yourself. So if you think the government is looking out for you, you are highly mistaken. It is looking out for itself, and you just happen to be the mission set. But it accepts all kinds of losses, and it doesn't really matter if there's a failure, as long as they can cover it up. So I don't feel good about any of that. Like, none of that seems like the way that we want to run things. We cannot be in a zero risk environment. Otherwise, you might as well just accept the premise. Here's another movie for you, Idiocracy, which was sort of prophetic, that Mike Judge wrote. And you might as well just sit on a toilet and order Uber Eats and watch Netflix and order packages from Amazon for new shirts and just sit there and eat and poop and watch TV and be entertained and wait until you die. Because that's kind of what, and put electrolytes on plants. This was the premise of that movie. And sadly enough, like, if you want to do a zero risk life, that's what it looks like. That doesn't look very fulfilling. There's no mountains being climbed. There's no ice skating. There's no taking your 5-year-old kid for a walk with your dog, because everything is scary then. So I don't want to live in that world, and I don't think other Americans necessarily do either. They got confused a little bit along the way.
What is the supposed agency or group of people that keeps the FBI accountable? How would a senior FBI agent answer that question? When you talk about holding politicians accountable, it's the voters, supposedly, but we see that that isn't really taking place anymore. But with the FBI, we don't elect FBI agents. So what is supposedly checking them?
So there's a couple internal mechanisms. There's an office that's kind of like internal affairs. It's called the Office of Professional Responsibility. I would say that that's been weaponized because I've been accused of multiple sort of foolish things from them. And their investigator that came and wanted to interview me ended up being interviewed by me on the other end. I actually taped it and I posted it. But I spent 68 minutes basically deciding that this was a very unserious person. And so we have unserious people that are investigating us internally.
Is it like HR? Is it sort of like an internal HR?
No, they're actually FBI agents. They just are people that want to live at headquarters and do that work. And it doesn't mean there's not some good people there. But the woman that I dealt with seemed like a fool, and she had a PhD in biochemistry after I looked her up, which is crazy. So she's been educated, but she doesn't know anything when it comes to real simple stuff like, if it's not against the law and I'm not hurting anybody, who cares? I was out shooting in the desert in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, and she was upset that people could hear me, which is crazy. But anyway, so OPR is one of those mechanisms, those internal watchdog mechanisms. And then the second thing would be outside of DOJ, there's a group that's called the Office of the Inspector General, and that is supposed to be, explicitly a watchdog group. But here's the real problem: when you look at a watchdog group, it's got to have a bark and it's got to have a bite. That's how watchdogs can be effective. Mostly that is not the case. That's why, our politicians are often not held accountable, because there's not a whole lot you can do to them unless somebody's going to prosecute. So the Office of the Inspector General does investigations and regularly alleges all kinds of FBI malfeasance. The sexual abuse, the sexual misconduct I'm talking about, it shows up all the time. People can go to justice.oig.gov and go look at their website and see these reports. You can just scroll it by FBI and see all kinds of stuff, like wild stuff. Some of the things that we've disclosed were in there. Like, there was a special agent in charge of the Miami field office who was having sex in a bureau vehicle with one of his subordinates and then treated her really poorly afterwards, which is probably not the best thing to do when you're the top guy in the office. And then he retired because there was no prosecution. There was no action that was against him. They basically let him run out the clock until he retired. And since OIG has no prosecutorial authorities, that has to go back to the DOJ. DOJ is the hand inside the glove is the FBI. So they're all on the same team, and their goal is, and this was actually said with the document that I released recently, this radical traditional Catholic document, the goal was not, hey, we should never write a piece that ostracizes a religion and tries to, go and violate the First Amendment. The goal was, how do we protect the brand of the FBI because it doesn't look good? Well, that's the opposite. But that is what government does. It's interested in its own appearances, not necessarily in the mission that's more pure.
If we look at some of the things that have come out, FBI scandals, I mentioned the Twitter files, the FBI paying Twitter $3.4 million, which isn't, sketchy at all. Meeting with Twitter execs once a week. You talk about, and I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Jim Comey FBI using the phony Steele dossier, which was paid for by the Clinton campaign, and was just a compilation of sources from Igor Danchenko's drinking partners, using that to get a FISA warrant to spy on members of the Trump organization. It seems like the FBI has been weaponized, not just, we can't even just say that it's been politically weaponized, but it really seems like it's been doing the bidding of the left in this country. And I find that to be so interesting because, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, sort of the general stereotype of the FBI and of the CIA is that it's conservative, that it's a bunch of white men with, this is the way people my age think of the FBI. White men with cowboy hats who, run around with their American flag and are supposed white supremacists. There's like this cartoon character version of what of FBI agents, but it always at the core of it is that people think of them as conservative. So it's so interesting to see what's come out recently because they're mainly things that are being weaponized against conservatives. Is it fair to say that the FBI has really become sort of an agent of the left wing, or is it more nuanced than that?
I think it's an astute question. So, Julie, I'm sitting 20 feet away from my cowboy hat. So I got one of those. I got an American flag behind me, and I got rifles behind me as well. So I fit all the molds of what you just said.
But you're not a white supremacist.
No, I'm not. And you know what? I don't know any white supremacists in the FBI.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Maybe they exist, but they sure as heck, nobody I ever was exposed to. In fact, I had a hard time finding white supremacists when we were investigating them because they just don't appear the way that people think they are. I think you're correct that essentially the people on the front lines, people say rank and file. I would say brick agents, the frontline field agents that are doing the work, tend to be a conservative lean. That is the kind of personality that goes into law enforcement. It's the kind of person that goes into the military. You kind of got to believe in something because it's a good paycheck, but it's not a astronomical paycheck. And there's some pride in doing it. I think the kind of people that are motivated to do that tend to be conservative. I think you're correct. Here's the problem. The people that want to promote. So one of the conservative values is family, right? And being able to take care of your family, being there for your family, being a decent, husband or wife, being a good father or mother. And one of the values that happens in the corporate climbing type part of the FBI, this is the senior executive service or the people who aspire to be in that service. Those people are really putting their family on hold in order to achieve whatever it is that they're going to get out of the FBI, to become a special agent in charge of a field office, to become the assistant director of something, the executive assistant director, and so on. So if you want to be at the top level of the bureau, you've got to really move your family around in a real ragged way. And a lot of times it might be 18-month turnarounds. So some of them, and this is fairly frequent, and this is where I think you get a lot of the sexual misconduct, they will leave their family in a place where the family feels rooted, whether it be in Chicago or Miami or Dallas or whatever, and they will go do 18 months away from their family to go to headquarters where they're living in an apartment and working for at the Hoover building. When you start doing things like that, it's very, I'm not saying that some people shouldn't leave their family and go do the thing that's right for their career. I just think that the types of people that do that in the bureau, their priority set is different than those who are on the front lines. So you get a much more government-centric group. You get people who sometimes have advanced degrees and spent more time in academia, and they spend a lot more time around support employees, and they care more about how the political winds are blowing. Because when you're out working cases, it's not political. It doesn't have to be, at least. It shouldn't be. But if you're going to be a supervisor and you're going to be starting to take marching orders that come out of DC, very different animal, very different type of people self-select. And here's the other wild thing. Up until maybe 15 or 18 years into your career, there's not a financial incentive to do that. It's really not there. So, your top FBI agents at GS 1310 are making $170,000, $175,000 a year. That's as much money as the guy who's running the field office or girl. So when you're looking at it, there's not a financial incentive there per se. And I think that's how you get these self-selected people. They're interested in the power. They're interested in the title. They're not interested in being FBI agents the way that most of the people that are on the front lines are interested in being. But unfortunately, once you put your hand up and to be a supervisor and you start climbing up that ladder, you're a certain type of person. And if you want to keep climbing, you have to continue to be that type of person.
And the more you climb, the more left-wing you tend to become. That's a very important distinction between the people on the ground making the gravy, doing the work, and then the people, in the offices behind computer screens sending memos. So you were talking about, you write this it's in your bio, and you were hinting at it, sexual misconduct, the FBI targeting parents who protest at school board meetings. We've talked a little bit about the abuse of FISA, about election interference, but I want to drill down into some specifics here. Can you go through each of these allegations and tell me what's going on here?
Yeah, which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with the targeting parents.
Okay, easy. So the week of October 20th, the Attorney General got up in front of Congress. I think he was in front of the Senate at the time, but I'm not 100% sure. And he stated and was questioned whether or not he could see, based on the National Association of School Boards letters, which were made public both to the White House and to the Justice Department, whether the AG could imagine using Patriot Act tools, which I'm going to expand to say, generally speaking, counterterrorism resources, whether he could see those resources being used to target parents at school boards as domestic terrorists. And his answer was emphatically no, I don't see that happening. On the 27th of October, I went to my congresswoman, whose name is Yvette Harrell. She was in the 2nd District of New Mexico, where I was in Las Cruces. And I went to her office and met with 2 members of her staff, her law enforcement liaison, who's a wonderful man, and the community relations woman, who I can't remember her name at the top of my head, but also a very, very nice lady. They took 2 pages worth of notes. And I gave them the memo showing that the counterterrorism assistant director, a guy named Carlton Peoples, had written up a discussion, and it was co-signed by the criminal division, but it was sent out by the counterterrorism division that we were going to introduce a new threat tag, which people can think of as like a hashtag. It's a way to tag information in a case file. And it was a threat tag that was EDU officials, and it was going to be used in order to tag investigations into people, not parents specifically, but who else is at school board meetings, who cause problems at school board meetings. So that was a red line for me. I'm a parent. I don't put my kids in government schools, but I know people who do. And it turns out one of my fellow whistleblowers was a guy who was out there complaining at a school board meeting. My buddy named Stephen Friend did exactly that and put himself on a list probably in some ways. So we know that those were happening. We know that there were investigations into it. And then another one of my whistleblower buddies, we've kind of started calling ourselves this little club. We call ourselves the Suspendables. And the Suspendables includes a guy who went out and grabbed the 24 or so investigations into different parents that were protesting at school board meetings or were saying loudly that they didn't like radical gender ideology or CRT. And those things, made it into FBI files in what's called the eGuardian lead system, which is a counterterrorism tool. It's meant for that. It's meant to suss out terrorists that are showing warning signs. And he brought those to Jim Jordan's office. So, the proof is in the pudding. The Bureau did the thing they said they didn't do. And that was the original whistleblower allegation that got me on the radar, I'm sure. But that happened in October of 2021.
So where is this coming from? Because, if I think about just a random FBI agent, what does he or she care if a parent is protesting at a school board meeting, unless that person, themselves really cares about the particular race or gender ideology? Is it really that there are certain individuals within the FBI who feel very strongly that those parents should not be protesting against the gender and race things, and that's what's directing it, like sort of the personal preference? Or is it more of a higher level, diktat coming from the government that you harass those parents?
I think it's the latter. So it comes down from on high. The DOJ tells the FBI what's going on, and the Attorney General sent out a memo to all special aid or all field offices saying what they were going to be doing, that they would be looking into this and prioritizing it, even though it's not a real priority based on my knowledge of what goes on. And I know what violent crime looks like, and it's not parents yelling at school board meetings. We all get these though. Like we would get these we would get these things from the eGuardian system. They're called leads. It's just basically like, here's a person, here's the allegation. If the resources exist and it fits into the sort of the purview of the field office, go do whatever is called, what do they say? There's a funny little euphemism. Any logical investigative steps, something to that effect. And so you do them. And sometimes it means you just call the person up and go, hey, somebody said you were being a jerk. You said something on Twitter. What did you mean by that? You said that the mayor was, enforcing some sort of policy and he's going to pay for this. What does that mean? And they would go, I mean that he's going to pay for this because I filed a lawsuit against him and we're suing him. And you go, okay. It could be something that vague and you go, okay, that was not worth my time. But it's a quick phone call and easily dismissed. And then you just dismiss the lead. The other alternative is that somebody comes out and they say, I'm going to do this thing. And you call them up and you go, hey, are you going to do this thing? And they go, no, I live in Brunswick, Canada. And you go, oh, do you know where Las Cruces, New Mexico is? And they go, no, I just saw something online. Okay, so I might dismiss that as well. That doesn't seem like that person has the ability to conduct the actual threat that they've conducted or they've expressed. So you go through logical investigative steps. Sometimes we go out and interview people and they would do weird things. I've been on interviews where people do strange stuff and they say things that are even dumber than what you started out there for. Like I go out there to ask him questions about him pretending to be a FBI agent on eBay for some reason. And then he tells me that he's obsessed with ISIS. And then you're like, oh God. So now I got to have a new case open. So people do weird things. Like the world is full of strange people. But that being said, I think that the headquarters units, generally the headquarters city, that's going to be the main field office, will have somebody that runs these leads. They'll send them out to the field and sometimes they'll ride them a little harder or they will put priority on them and they'll say, hey, we need to see this generated into a case because of fill in the blank pressure. And if you're pressured to open a case and you open one, then I think you're failing as an agent. But that doesn't mean people don't do it. They tell you to open a case on a January 6th subject and you don't see even the predication there. Your boss tells you to open it. Either you do or you don't. And, we just had an instance. I've got an allegation. This happened in Boston. Somebody was told to open a case, didn't think that there was enough predication, which is to say an allegation or information that a crime was committed and that the person that we're talking about committed that crime, said no and was immediately removed from their job and put onto the surveillance detail, what I used to do, which was not something they wanted to do. It doesn't mean they lost their job or their paycheck, but it's not good when you start doing retaliations because people are upholding what they believe their oath requires of them.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about the sexual misconduct. I'm going to move on to the others just for the sake of time because
Sure.
you gave specifics about that. So let's just quickly talk about the abuse of FISA and election interference. It's hard to quickly talk about those subjects, but obviously the most famous FISA example is being weaponized against members of the Trump campaign. Are there other instances of abuse of the FISA warrants that you would like to share? And also, when you talk about election interference, can you be more specific about what the FBI allegedly did?
Yep. So FISA is actually pretty straightforward. It's abused every day. So there are multiple ways that FISA can be utilized in the law enforcement sphere. The one that people are most familiar with is what's called a full FISA, or what we call a full FISA, which is to say it's a foreign entity. You go out there and you go in front of the FISC, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and you present this massive file and all of your findings and your probable cause statements and so on. And then you have a Woods file, which is supposed to be sort of the check and the balance on all the things that you consider to be facts. And then the judge, because it's an ex parte hearing, there's no one else there except the members of the DOJ or FBI that are making the argument. So that's supposed to be what's done. So that's the full FISA. Those are actually not nearly as common as 702, or they take a lot longer to get, and there's a lot more rigor. The failure in the Trump campaign was obviously seems to be very politically motivated because somebody lost their job and lied and manipulated the information. But 702 is a different section of the FISA. It's a specific section of the law that allows a much less rigorous process to be engaged in. And I've written them up in a morning. Like a full FISA will take a couple of weeks to put together, to go and argue, to get all the facilities collected and so on. But 702 collection can be done in a couple of days. It can be done in a morning if you're motivated. And essentially, what you're able to do is target a non-U.S. entity person who is not in the United States and is not a U.S. citizen. So those protections are not there. And they are acting on behalf of or under the influence of a foreign intelligence state or a foreign power, rather. And then you can nominate those facilities for monitoring. But the problem is, if you are a FBI agent who is sworn. There's no such thing as a special agent, by the way. That's what we call people who work for the FBI, but the job is known as 1811. That's the series of federal employment, and that means criminal investigator. So even though you may not be specifically charged with doing criminal investigations at some point in time in your career, your job is criminal investigator. And so people that come into that background are trying to investigate crimes. So when we talk about abuse of the 702, essentially we're looking at all of the emails and the text messages and the phone calls and things like that are going back and forth between some foreign spy, let's say, and whoever they talk to, whatever we can see. And if they talk to an American, like that's the most interesting thing, right? I mean, don't you want to know who the Americans are that are talking to foreign spies? Would that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. It's explicitly illegal to do that.
Sorry. I would want to know.
You would, and that's the problem. That's why the abuse
illegal.
happens, because
Right.
it's referred to as reverse targeting, and so people will hear that buzzword. That's what it means. It means to use somebody else. I'm looking at you, but I want to see who you talk to, and then I'm going to target those people. That's reverse targeting. It's explicitly forbidden by federal law, and it's really the only way that tool makes sense to most people who work in that business. So you're actually setting them up for failure. And my example or my analogy would be the way 702 works is imagine your TSA agent, and their job is to make sure they find all the guns before they get on an airplane. And everybody's got to go through a metal detector, right? So they go through the metal detector, and we're supposed to look for guns, but you can't use the metal detector results to determine if there's a gun or not.
Right.
How do you do that? Like they're going to still do it. They're still going to find the guns, and they're going to use the metal detector. So 702, which has been suggested by the Biden administration to go back up again, it's an incredibly dangerous tool. The NSA collects all this stuff, but the FBI shouldn't be looking at it. So that's how that's abused. Election interference was pretty straightforward, the stuff that I saw. The Bureau, getting involved in the Twitter files type stuff. So people know these things. Elvis Chan weighing in and trying to get rid of certain types of accounts that were saying some things that they deemed, unlikable or derogatory. The second thing is that the Bureau was engaged in pulling agents who they believed were conservative off of election fraud cases in order to keep the sort of Trump supporters. They assume this, by the way. They're like, oh, you have 9 kids and you're a Catholic, you're probably a Trump supporter and you can't be on the election fraud squad. And all those people, it turned out, were probably unvaccinated as well. So there's a big targeting of people internally in the Bureau that didn't get the COVID-19 shots. And if you chose not to do that, you basically are on a watch list. And every single person that I've seen that's been suspended is an unvaccinated Christian of some flavor. So that's interference in the election just by picking who's going to do the actual investigations.
Wow. I don't know. I don't know whether to be depressed after this interview or so happy that, someone like you exists. Obviously, I am both, but it's really amazing how many people who have worked in the government have come out and been these whistleblowers. I mean, even I've only been doing the show for a few months. I've interviewed Andrew Bustamante of the CIA, Tom Baker of the FBI, you formerly of the FBI, and more people, as you said, are coming out and exposing this rampant corruption. My final question for you is, what's the path forward?
Well, there's what I would assume should happen, and there's what's actually probably going to happen, which is not good. What should happen is the FBI should be probably dismantled. It's kind of like when you have a brand and let's say you put out food and the food kills like 11 people because it had E. coli or something like that. You can't keep marketing, Tasty Greens. That's not going to be it. You got to change your name, and you probably got to start over and maybe get a new facility to screen your stuff. In the case of the FBI, we've got targeting of pro-life conservatives. We have going after parents who are also conservatives. We have this memo that I disclosed that showed that they were going to try to recruit sources inside the Catholic Church who are conservative. So you're doing this aggressive targeting. You've got the targeting of the Trump campaign. You've got the abuse of the arrest process by putting a SWAT team out there to go after an old man like Roger Stone, who's a very nice man, but not a physical threat to most people. You've got the running after Peter Navarro, like you name it. We've done, and then of course the famous raid at Mar-a-Lago at this point. And then you can see the alternative. We haven't gone after Antifa. And I know that for a fact because I was out seeing some of these things and they said that they love their activists there in Portland, so they weren't going to go after them. So you see that problem. If you're not going to do what your job is, except for one side of the coin, we have to trash you. Like the FBI can only exist if it is beyond repute, if it is beyond any kind of question, and the honor and the integrity of what's going on there is not something that half the country is looking at askance, and they currently are. Very dangerous. So I would say it has to be torn down. My second offer is, and this probably also won't happen, but they should just get rid of the domestic intelligence mission at the very minimum. If you're going to keep the FBI, take the intelligence capability away from it, because that is very scary. And that's the thing that's being abused. And it leads to all the other sort of cultural rots that go along. I don't think they're going to do that either. I don't think they're going to do anything. That's the worst thing. I think that the path forward is we are going to have a really rough next 2 years. And then we're going to do the thing that we should have figured out this year in the midterms last year. We're going to find out whether or not the American people are going to continue down and try to destroy this country all the way, which is what it's looking like. Or if we'll have a radical swing back to the right where people go, look, we all agree that America's a good place. We don't agree on how to get to the best version of it. And we're going to bite the bullet and do things that are hard to do. I just don't know. Like we've got to get rid of a lot of this government. And unfortunately, that's not what's being done. Like the Bureau was just given another $1.5 billion for the fiscal year 2023. So it's not going to have any self-reflection, and it's not going to slow down. And I don't see any hearings scheduled, and I don't see any office space booked, and I don't see a phone number for the Weaponization Committee, which is supposed to be looking into this. So they're taking their sweet time. Meanwhile, I'm today is 316 days since I got kicked out of the FBI's office, and they still consider me an employee, which is absurd because I haven't gotten a paycheck since June of last year from it. So
Olivia will go around and tell people that.
She sure will. Yeah, 300 plus days. Daddy's been out of work.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for coming on. It's really been an honor to speak with you. Thank you so much for your service to our country and your continued service to our country. Arguably your role now, even though, as you like to joke about, you're unemployed, I really think your role now is the most important one that you've ever had.
I tend to agree. I appreciate the opportunity. It was fun.
Well, we'll do it again. Because believe it or not, I had so many more questions I was going to ask you. Thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us today. And remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Take care.